I am extremely excited about this. I read the first book, and I can't wait to finish the second book. And if there is any time like now, we need this kind of encouragement, direction, and fellowship. So I have here two different kinds of bios to read for Kazu Haga. And I chose to read the shorter one because I'm a preacher and I don't know how to shut my mouth, and I knew I was going to take too much time. So, but please get to know him afterwards and ask more questions about who he is and where he's from and the things that he's done. But I want to let you know that he's a trainer and practitioner of nonviolence and restorative justice, a core member of the Fierce Vulnerability Network, a founding core member of Ahimsa Collective, a jam facilitator, author of Healing Resistance, a radically different response to harm, and Fierce Vulnerability, Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. He works with incarcerated people, youth, and activities from around the country. He has over 25 years of experience. He don't look like he's more than 25 years old in nonviolence and social change work. He is a resident of the Mechanical Farm community in Les Jeunes, Olo, Lonely, land in Oakland, California, where he lives with his family. You can find out more about his work at www.kazuhaga.com. So without further ado, I will shut my mouth and turn you over to Kazu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Hinton. I'm 44, by the way, so and I'm feeling every bit of it too. I have an 11-month-old, and the last two nights, because they're up in New York right now, I've gotten to sleep until like 9 o'clock for the first time in 11 months. So I'm feeling a little refreshed, but still, I I uh I sat down too quickly the other day. My knees almost went out, so I'm definitely not young. But so grateful to be here. So grateful that all of you showed up. Really grateful to the Baltimore Peace Builders, Gary and Barbara and everyone else. Um, and I'll start by sharing that we did a virtual book launch when the book came out, March 25th. And, like I was supposed to do at a book launch, I read from parts of my book, and I'm really happy with the way the book came out, but it felt static, just like reading from a book. And so even if I end up sharing a lot of the same stories that are from the book, I'm probably not going to read from it directly. But just, yeah, I have no idea what I'm going to share, but just see what stories emerge in our time together. And we'll probably open it up for discussion, questions, responses, reflections at about 8 o'clock, and we'll go till about 8:30. So yeah, here we go. Let's see what comes out. Um, I was born in Japan. If you read my first book, you know a little bit about my story, but I was born in Japan. I moved to the US when I was 7 years old, and I had a really good childhood until I moved to the United States. And then my life kind of very quickly unraveled. My father died when I was 11 years old, and with him died our visa. We were here on my father's green card visa, and so my mother ended up having to remarry, and she remarried a guy who helped us get a green card, but was also a very hurt individual, right? Hurt people, and he had gone through so much abuse in his life and didn't know what to do with it, and he ended up releasing it on us, and we had a really, really chaotic childhood growing up. And I dropped out of high school when I was 15 and was, getting in and out of trouble and getting high every day and not doing anything with my life. And then when I was 17 years old, I met a group of Buddhist monastics, Japanese Buddhist monastics, from an order called Nippon Zammyo Hoji. And they're Buddhist monastics that were really dedicated to nonviolence and social change work. And they were organizing a walking pilgrimage. They were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast of New Orleans and then eventually down the coast of Africa. There was a project called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. And they were going to retrace the Middle Passage with an understanding that if we're going to talk about issues of race and racism today, we actually have to go all the way back to its roots and heal that legacy. And so I heard about this walk a week before it started, and I was 17 years old, was doing nothing with my life, and I was just bored. And so I told my mom I would check it out for the first week. I was going to walk from Leverett, Massachusetts to Boston, and I ended up leaving home for a year and a half. I still remember on the third day of the walk, we were, these monastics drum and chant while they walk, drumming and chanting. And it just like, it became so clear that this is where I needed to be. And so I walked all the way to New Orleans, 6 months, and one of the nuns from the order, Jun-san, took me under her wing. And when we got to New Orleans, or right before we got to New Orleans, she was like, our order is building the world's biggest peace pagoda. It was a big structure dedicated to world peace in Lumbini, Nepal, which was the site of the Buddha's birth. And she said, why don't you come with me? And I had no idea what Nepal was, where it was, what language they spoke, but again, instantly I knew that that was the next step in my journey. So I bought a one-way ticket to Nepal at 17 years old, and I ended up living in their monasteries in Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka for a year, studying Buddhism, studying nonviolence. And so when I came back from this journey, I was on fire. And I became a nonviolence trainer in the late 1990s, preparing people to go into mass demonstrations for the anti-globalization movement and movements to free Mumia Abu-Jamal and the movement to close the School of Americas and all these campaigns. And as much as I love my time as a nonviolence trainer, at some point I felt like something was missing. Like we weren't having the conversations that we needed to have. So I stopped doing it. I couldn't quite put a finger on what it was, but I stopped giving those trainings. And I remain active in social justice movements, but I stopped having a relationship with the word nonviolence for a long time. And then in the fall of 2008, I took this 2-day workshop on a philosophy called Kingian nonviolence, based on the philosophies of Dr. Martin Luther King. And that 2-day workshop just changed my life forever. This was 10 years into my life as an activist. I thought I had some idea of what the word nonviolence meant. I thought I had some idea of who Dr. King was. I realized in that workshop that I had no idea what the word nonviolence meant, and no one had ever taught me anything about Dr. Martin Luther King. Like, the little things that you learn in school, and I have a dream speech and whatever, but just how deep of a philosopher and a revolutionary he was. And so since then, I've been on this never-ending journey to better understand what it means to be a practitioner of nonviolence. And if you read my first book, Healing Resistance, like that's where the story ends, right? Healing Resistance was my interpretation and my spin on the teachings of Dr. King and this philosophy of Kingian nonviolence. And so for many years, I was just doing these Kingian nonviolence trainings over and over and over and over again all over the country. And eventually I started working with incarcerated people, on spreading the teachings of Kingian nonviolence in the prisons throughout California. And that got me into doing restorative justice work as well. And restorative justice work led me to doing deep trauma healing work, both with the incarcerated men that I was working with, but also for myself. One of the principles of Kingian nonviolence, the fifth principle, says avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. And there's a beautiful quote that says, hating someone is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And I realized that, as I was giving these Kingian trainings, like I hadn't been in a physical confrontation in many, many years, but I had anger in my heart and I had resentment in my heart and I had a lot of unhealed trauma in my heart. And they were forms of violence that I was doing to myself. And so I started going on this healing journey and really realizing that this is what the world needs is not just new pieces of legislation, but we need healing. One of the incarcerated trainers that I work with in Soledad State Prison in California, Bill G, once told me that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. That so often we only think so far as to how to fix the issue, like what's the new legislation that we need to pass, what's the CEO that we need to kick out of office, what's the politician that we need to get into office. But we never think about how to heal the relationships between communities that have been impacted by whatever conflict it is you're working on. And if you don't heal the relationship, the underlying resentment that created the conflict is still there. So it's only a matter of time before another conflict surfaces. So nonviolence, I understood at its best, is about resolving, fixing issues because that is important, but it's also about healing ourselves and healing our relationships. And so, fast forward many, many years, I was having a conversation with one of my closest friends, Chris Moore Backman, who was a Gandhian nonviolence trainer. And he wrote a book called The Gandhian Iceberg. And him and I, for many, many years, did trainings around the country, and we were really close. And for many years, we were talking about the word nonviolence. Like we were both deeply, deeply committed practitioners of nonviolence. And we also understood, as especially as someone who lives in Oakland, California, and has worked in Oakland for a long time, there are so many misunderstandings about the word nonviolence. People think it's passive, people think it's weak, people think it's about not doing something as opposed to doing something about violence. And so it's become like a hindrance, particularly in a lot of communities of color that we want to work with. When we use the word nonviolence, people just walk away. And so for many years, we were having this conversation about we need to just find a different word, right? Like we once we get people in the room, we can talk about this thing that matters so much to us, but we just need to call it something else. Um, and so, we spent like 2, 3 years talking about this. And at some point during that conversation, these words fierce vulnerability emerged. And if I have time, I'll share the story about exactly how that came about. But something like stuck with fierce vulnerability. And we ultimately decided to continue to use the word nonviolence because we decided that it ties us to such an important lineage and we don't want to lose that lineage. So we were going to do the hard work of educating people and reclaiming the revolutionary spirit and power of nonviolence. But these words, fierce vulnerability, just like it took on a life of its own in our hearts. And so we were trying to understand what fierce vulnerability was. And as two trainers, what are we going to do but design a training called Fierce Vulnerability and figure out what it's trying to tell us? So we reached out to two friends of ours, Sierra and Norali, and designed a 2-day experiment called Fierce Vulnerability. Um, and I think this is the one part of the book that I actually want to read, partly because this was co-written by myself and Chris and Sierra and Norali. So just as a kind of um, way to respect their work as well. We put this description out of the first ever Fierce Vulnerability workshop in, I forgot when it was. It was a lot of years ago. And the invitation to the workshop read, how do we stop injustice in its tracks while acknowledging the interconnectedness of all people? How do we protect ourselves while nurturing a relationship with our brokenheartedness? How do we build a movement that can shut down a highway while creating a culture of opening up? How do we build a movement with the militancy to occupy a government building and the sensitivity to see it as an act of healing? How can we come to experience vulnerability as a strength, not a weakness? Our world is in crisis. Our social systems are being torn apart. Our economic systems have created historical levels of wealth disparity, and Earth's life support systems are on the brink of collapse. The need for a powerful direct action movement that nurtures a radical, fundamental transformation has never been greater. Despair seems to be in the air we breathe and can be felt in the depths of our hearts. Yet our need is not only a transformation of systems and laws and policies. What we yearn for is a fundamental transformation of our hearts, our values, and our relationships to ourselves, to each other, and to the earth. Fierce vulnerability is an attempt to build such a movement that understands the assertiveness needed to address the crises of our times, a movement that sees social change as a radical act of healing, a movement that knows each of us needs to heal as much as those we may feel compelled to blame, a movement that knows violence hurts all parties, a movement that will never see any individual as disposable, undeserving of dignity, and incapable of transformation. And we put that out, and we had to close registration within 24 hours. Like something about that language hit a nerve. And so we ended up doing another Fierce Vulnerability workshop the following weekend, and then another one, and then another one. And many of you know the Fellowship of Reconciliation. At some point, the Fellowship of Reconciliation reached out to us, and they have this annual regional conference of the Northwest region at CBEC, right outside of Seattle in Washington. And it's a conference that's been going on for over 60 years consecutively. And they called us and they said, "We want to turn the entire conference over to you. Like, we want you to turn this conference of 200 people into a fierce vulnerability workshop for 2.5 days, 200 people." And so we trained 20 trainers to give this training, and we ran a fierce vulnerability workshop for 200 people outside of CBAC. And so through all of these experiments, we began to understand a little bit better what fierce vulnerability was. Um, and ultimately it became this book. Uh, I think I'll just share a few stories about some of the key moments. In 2012 is is during the time of Occupy Wall Street, is when I really started to begin to take my own trauma healing journey seriously. And I attended this thing called a jam. Jams are these week-long experiences that are organized by this organization called Yes. Jams are called jams because they're modeled after a musician's jam. We have these week-long retreats, and as facilitators, I'm a jam facilitator now. We don't go in with any agenda. We just try to feel what the group needs in each moment and tries to adjust based on that. Jams continue to be one of the most healing spaces I've ever been to in my entire life. And the first jam I went to, my friend Shilpa, who was the executive director of the organization at the time, invited me. And at the time, I wasn't someone that cried a lot. And I knew jams were this like vulnerable place where people share a lot of vulnerable stories. So I remember in an opening check-in, I looked at Shilpa and I was like, I challenge you to make me cry. And little did I know that Shilpa is one of the greatest kind of like holders of space I have ever met in my entire life. She can make anybody cry. And so I was one of the first people to completely break down in tears at that retreat. And it was during a gender fishbowl where those of us who identified as men were sitting in a circle in the inner circle, and everyone else was sitting outside watching us. And people were sharing vulnerable stories. So I was like, I'll share a vulnerable story. I'll share a story about my childhood trauma. About because right around that time, I had become aware that I had a lot of shame in my life for not having been there for my sisters when things were really hard with my stepfather. When there was a lot of violence in our home, that's when I stopped coming home. It's when I started getting high and drinking. And, I was only 12, 13 when all this started. So, like, intellectually, I was like, I was doing the best I can, right? Um, but my body just felt so much shame. And so I had been thinking about this a lot. So I was like, oh, I'll share this. And as much as I was noticing that I was holding a lot of shame around it, at the same time, I told myself the story like, oh, this was 20 years ago. Like, I went to monastery, I've been doing all this activist work, like, I've healed from him. I'm so glad I've moved on. But it's a, bit of a vulnerable share, so I'll share it for the first time in a group, right? And the moment I started talking about that story, I went into a state of panic and I could barely get a breath in. And I was just bawling and crying and crying and crying. And in that moment, I realized how delusional I was, telling myself, oh, it was 20 years ago, I'm over it. And so it was the first time I realized that I need to have a conversation with my family. It was the scariest conversation I could ever imagine having. It took me 8 years from that point of going to therapy and meditation retreats and more jams to build up the courage to have this conversation with my family and to tell them that I was sorry, that I wasn't there. Um, Fast forward again, one of the key concepts in fierce vulnerability is the idea that the universe is built on fractals, right? What happens at the smallest scale is not only possible at the largest scale, but it happens in the same way. Like fractals, you're driving down a desert highway and you see a dust devil. when hot air mixes with cold air, it creates like a tiny little tornado. And if you zoom out of the fractal, you see an actual tornado, creates the same shape. You keep zooming out, you see a hurricane, especially from the top, you see that it creates the same shape. You keep zooming out, and you look at how planets rotate around its sun, and you keep zooming out, and you see how a galaxy rotates around the center of its axis. Like, no matter how small or how large the scale, because the universe is built on fractals, the same pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. And so, through my own trauma healing journey, I realized that there's a very similar dynamic that happens in the United States of America, where we want to talk about racial healing, and people say, oh, that happened 500 years ago. That happened 300 years ago. We're over it. It's post-racial America. Aren't we so glad that slavery isn't a thing anymore? And we like to pretend that because time has passed, we've moved on, right? But we've never actually had a conversation about it as a nation. Of course, like small pockets of progressive people talk about it all the time. Just like maybe my two sisters would kind of like whisper to each other about our childhood experiences. But until we can actually come to the table, have these really difficult discussions, we can't just get over it. That's not how trauma works. And so I realized in these experiences that when we are out there advocating for racial justice, what we're really trying to do is to bring these conversations to the surface so we can actually talk about it in a safe container, right? That's nonviolence work at its best, is trying to bring up these difficult issues so we can talk about it so we can heal from those wounds. I have a family member who's been through a lot of trauma and has not had a lot of resolution from it, hasn't had a lot of opportunities to work through them. And so, like, all the time, they're in a state of crisis. And it feels like we're playing this like endless game of whack-a-mole, where it's like we help them through one crisis, and then a couple months later, they're in a crisis with their two kids, and then we help them through that, and then a few months later, they're in a crisis in their workplace. And we're like playing this endless game of whack-a-mole. And I realized like we were, because this family member experienced some core trauma early in their childhood and they had a core wound. And if we didn't help them integrate that core wound, we were just dealing with the surface level manifestations of a much deeper pain. And similarly, the United States of America, early in its collective childhood, experienced some incredibly traumatic events: enslavement, genocide, indentured servitude. And we're so busy playing this endless game of whack-a-mole, dealing with these surface level manifestations. Like, this country is never short of crises to attend to. And we are playing this endless game of whack-a-mole because we're actually not having the conversation about the core pain points that is giving rise to all of these like surface level manifestations of a such deeper wound. And so, similar to how I talked about in healing resistance, so much of the work of fierce vulnerability is about understanding that resistance work at its best is actually about healing. When I was at Standing Rock, I remember the elders would tell us every time we were going to town to engage in direct action, they always said, remember, you're going to town to engage in ceremony. And I always took that to heart. And I've been thinking about it ever since. Like, what does that look like to use protest and nonviolent direct action as ceremony? Um, so much of the work of fierce vulnerability is understanding or trying to move with this understanding that injustice is actually not a political thing, that injustice is a manifestation of our collective trauma. And if we can understand injustice as a manifestation of collective trauma, then how would we respond to it differently? Many of our social movements, even nonviolent movements, move with the spirit of we're here to shut things down, right? And tactically, that might still be a need. We might need to shut down coal-fired power plants and government meetings and corporate board meetings and whatever it is. But I've come to understand that you can't shut down injustice any more than you can shut down trauma. Right? Like, you can't go to a traumatized person or a group of traumatized individuals and point our fingers and say, stop doing that thing that you're doing. If your only goal is to fix issues and get that person to do something that you want them to do or pass a piece of legislation, it might be effective. But if your goal is healing, you can't go to traumatized people and wave our fingers and say, stop doing that. But in so many of our movements, that's what we do, right? We go to these spaces and we wave our fingers and say, stop doing that thing. We demand this, we demand that. And if healing is our goal, that will never be effective. And so one of the $1 million questions of fierce vulnerability is how do we shut down a highway, but still spiritually move with the spirit of we're here to open things up, not shut things down? Because when you're healing trauma, that's what you need to do. You need to create a space that feels safe enough where people can open up. And what does that look like? Um, because of the law of fractals, I'm learning so much from my own personal life. And this is an insight that I had just a couple weeks ago. So it's actually not in the book. But I have an aunt who used to be my favorite aunt. Um, her and my uncle were my favorite aunt and uncles as a kid. She was my hippie aunt, she was like my cool hippie aunt. And over the last 10 years, however long it's been, she's become a climate change denying Trump supporter. And there are many people on the progressive left that have, gone in that direction over the years. And when I think about engaging with her, most of my family's like, don't talk to her. It's not worth it. Like, do not engage with her. Just ignore her. Because she's constantly sending me emails about, YouTube videos that I should watch and whatever else. And it's frustrating. So I want to talk to her. But my family's like, don't bother. And so much of the lineage of nonviolence is about learning to speak truth, right? Learning to speak truth to power. And so when I picture myself engaging with her, a truth that I could say to her, some of the first truths that emerges in my mind is your understanding of climate science is wrong. And that is true. I really do believe that. But there's a deeper truth that I could also try to communicate with her. And that deeper truth sounds a little bit like you used to be my favorite aunt, and I grieve the relationship that we don't have anymore. And I'm concerned that you are isolating yourself from the rest of your family. And what happened that make you believe these things? What about these beliefs matters to you so much that you're willing to risk relationships with your family? Like, what is going on? How are you? That's a much more vulnerable truth than you're wrong. But it's also a truth that I have a feeling gives us a better opportunity to actually connect and open up and move towards healing. Like if I go to her and say, your understanding of climate science is wrong, I might be right, but it's not going to lead to healing. It's not going to lead to her opening up. And so much of the work of fierce vulnerability has been about experimenting with like how can we take those lessons and extrapolate them to larger and larger scales of the fractal. Even as we engage in nonviolent direct action, how can we lead instead of a message of we are here to shut things down because you're wrong and we demand this piece of legislation? What if we led with we are here because our hearts are breaking and we need you to see the impact that these policies are having on us and our communities? And in so many ways, that is like the lineage of nonviolence, right? Um, and so, how do we model vulnerability, even in our engagement with forces of injustice, using our own vulnerability as a way to touch the humanity of the people around us to try to actually open up discussions that are not possible right now? Like every trauma healing space I've ever been to, the moment one person models vulnerability, the what's possible in that space is radically altered. The moment one person is able to share from deep in their hearts. And at the same time, my story about the first jam that I went to, it was actually not the first time I told that story. It was the first time I told it in a group. The first time I ever talked about the shame that I was starting to feel was actually one-on-one with a friend. And because of a lot of different reasons, that friend wasn't capable of holding me in that moment. And so, I was telling this friend that, I'm having a lot of shame for realizing that I wasn't there for my family. And the way that they responded was, well, yeah, you're a guy, so you had the privilege to leave and not be there. And it's true. That's also true. Like, I am a man. I did have the privilege to leave when my sisters didn't. That's true. And it also completely shut me down. And one of the messages that I received in that moment was, I am never telling the story again. I am never opening up, right? And so it's possible to open up with vulnerability and be like have the response be something that completely shuts us down and even re-traumatizes us. And so a lot of the work that we're doing with fierce vulnerability is, okay, if we're considering leading in nonviolent direct action with our hearts open, talking about how heartbroken we are, what is the emotional and spiritual preparation that we need to do to keep ourselves safe and protected? There's a beautiful quote from the Reverend Nadia Boltz-Weber who says, "Preach from your scars, not from your wounds." Right? Like if you're up there preaching and you're talking about a wide open wound, a trauma that you had never processed, integrated, then like who knows what will happen? You might lose control and you might put the audience in a position where they have to support you when you're up there as the preacher. And so what is the work that we need to do in our own communities to prepare our own hearts to be able to lead with vulnerability? But we've done enough holding of each other around these pain points that we can lead with the message of we are here because we are hurting, because we are scared, because we are confused, and still have some layer of protection. You know, when I was young and I was doing those nonviolence trainings before I really found out about what the word nonviolence meant, we would, you know, teach people how to form blockades and how to work with the police and all of these different things. And the work of fierce vulnerability is trying to advocate that in addition to those things, nonviolence trainers need to be training our communities in how to breathe, and how to sing songs, like immediate emotional regulation tools that we can utilize when we are in states of panic, but also long term creating more and more access points for trauma healing work to happen in movement spaces. Not so that we can heal our own traumas. Like one of the things that I talk about in the book is that the idea of individual healing and individual liberation is a delusion. Like in an interdependent world, there is no such thing as individual liberation. There's only collective liberation. So trauma healing work, meditation, all these things isn't just so you can feel better. For me and for us at Fierce Vulnerability Network, it's about being more grounded so that we can practice nonviolence in more and more escalated spaces. We know from neuroscience and all these things that weren't available to Dr. King and Gandhi and all these people, that when we are in states of panic, when our trauma is triggered, the part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of our brain that is not only capable of thinking about logic and long-term rationale, it's also the part of our brain that is able to have visions and imagination. It's the part of our brain that is able to empathize and to take in new information and to consider different perspectives, opposing perspectives. It's the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about concepts like interdependence. When we're in states of panic, that part of our brain is physiologically not available to us, right? Like the amygdala, which is an older part of the brain, shuts down the prefrontal cortex because the prefrontal cortex is a part of our brain that requires a lot of energy. And so when our body feels like it's in danger, it channels all of that energy to the parts of our brain that is responsible for immediate survival. And when you're in a moment of immediate survival, when a saber-toothed tiger is running after you, there's no point in thinking about nuance, right? There is no point in thinking about interdependence or trying to empathize with that saber-toothed tiger. You just need to run. And so, as a survival mechanism, our body has learned that when we are in panic, to shut off the part of our brain that is capable of practicing nonviolence, that is capable of listening to the other side, that is capable of healing our own selves, right? And so the more we can practice emotional regulation tools in our own lives and our own communities, the more we can heal our own traumas, the more grounded our nervous system will be, and the less likely it is that we get to this place where nonviolence and reconciliation and healing and listening and nuance is not available to us. You know, talking about fractals again, know from science now that when we are in these states of panic, we lose our ability to think about nuance. everything becomes black and white. We become hyper vigilant, right? These are all survival mechanisms. And if we look at the law of fractals and we zoom out into society, because of climate crisis and pandemics and war and genocide and collectively we are in a state of panic. And so collectively as a species, we have lost our ability to think about nuance, lost our ability to listen to different perspectives. We are hyper vigilant as a culture, right? And so how can we use nonviolence, resistance work as a way to collectively like ground our collective nervous system so we can have conversations that lead to healing? Um, so much of the work that we need to do today, we need to do in the midst of the most escalated crises of the history of our species, really, right? Like we have never been here before. We have never been to this point where like we might not survive another few generations. That's a legitimate thing that is happening. Authoritarian regimes sprouting up all over the world, pandemics, all these things we've never experienced, climate. Um, and that is a really scary place to be. Um, and if we are not working on grounding ourselves and healing our own wounds so that we can stay connected to that prefrontal cortex, that nonviolence brain, then it is so easy for us to go into states of panic and everything becomes binary us and them. In nonviolence work, we've always been taught that the more a conflict escalates, the more violence escalates, the more we have to escalate our nonviolent response to that conflict. Like if someone is experiencing a low intensity level of conflict, you can just go to that person and say, "Hey, everything's going to be fine. Just take a deep breath," right? Perfectly appropriate response. But if you go to someone who is extremely agitated and say, "Hey, everything's fine. Just take a deep breath," you might get punched in the face, right? It's not the appropriate response to that heightened level of conflict. And if we zoom out of the fractal again, this is why the movement for Black Lives has never filled out a petition, right? Because filling out a petition is an appropriate response to a very low intensity level of conflict. But when you're responding to hundreds of years of state violence, that is a really escalated conflict. And a more appropriate response might be to shut down a highway, right? And at the same time, in all of my years, I've realized that the more we use escalated tactics, like shutting down a highway, the more we tend to escalate this black-white binary worldview where it's clearly us versus them. We are the good people, they're the bad people. We need to beat them in order for us to achieve justice. And I'm afraid that that black, white, us versus them worldview is at the heart of what is destroying this planet, right? It is this delusion that I am somehow separate from them, that my liberation isn't bound with the liberation of all people. And so, how do we respond to the most escalated crises of our times while doubling down on healing? And the one last thing that I'll share, and then love to open it up, is um, my partner Lee Sen, who's currently in New York. I was at a fierce vulnerability workshop years ago, and they said this thing. They said that nonviolent direct action oftentimes sounds like a bullhorn, right? And it's like in action spaces, like oftentimes actually you do literally use a bullhorn, right? And she said, can nonviolent direct action instead make the sound of a meditation bell? Like if you've ever been to a monastery, a lot of monasteries, they have these like big bells that they ring throughout the day. And the noise, it just like pierces through the entire monastery. And it's an invitation for us to just pause and take one deep breath and become aware of what's alive for us in that moment. Like it's a moment of introspection. It's loud enough that it still pierces through the entire monastery. Everyone hears it. But instead of shutting down, it kind of like asks people to go inward. And so can we use nonviolent direct action not to like scream in people's ear, because we recognize that the violence that we are witnessing in the world today is so extreme that we do need escalated responses. But instead of yelling into people's ear, can we use nonviolent direct action to make people question their relationship with themselves, with their families, with the rest of existence, with Earth? Can we use nonviolent direct action to actually make people feel something? And I've always been taught that one of the main purposes of nonviolent direct action is to harness power so we can use that power to make demands, right? And not to say that there isn't a role for that, but also we were playing around a lot with this idea of can we use nonviolent direct action to help people grieve all of the losses that are happening throughout our world every single day? Because if we have all of this unprocessed grief, it's one of the things that helps people continue to live in this delusion that everything is fine. Right? It's so scary to actually sit with the reality of what is happening in this world so we don't grieve and we just pretend that everything is fine. And so can we actually use nonviolence as a way to help people grieve this direct action that we've been fantasizing about and doing in the Bay Area is like, what if we could get a group of activists to shut down a major highway, a major intersection, and then in the middle of that intersection, invite artists and dancers and ceremony leaders and religious leaders to hold a public grief ritual and then have therapists and healers and restorative justice facilitators there to talk to all of the people that are passing by and inviting them into the process and getting them involved. Like, can we make direct action more invitational? Like so many people have seen direct action over and over and over and over again that when they see a protest, they're like, oh, it's another protest, and they just walk right past. But can we design actions in a way that makes people curious, that invites them in, that gets them to feel something that they might not be used to feeling on an everyday basis? And if we can do that, then what might be possible? What opportunities might that open up? And so, the first words of the book, Fierce Vulnerability, is I don't know what fierce vulnerability is because I really don't. It's still an experiment for us. Um, and I feel like so much of what the world is calling for us in this moment is to have the humility to understand that there are changes happening on this planet that are so much larger than what we can control and what we can know. And that we just need to have the humility to say, I actually don't know what it is that we need to do as a species right now, but that's not going to shut me down. I'm going to keep trying and asking the right questions and staying close enough to the earth that we can hear the gentle feedback from the universe that's telling us that we're either moving in the right direction or we're not. Um, and so that's just a few thoughts about fierce vulnerability and how I'm beginning to understand it. And yeah, I would just want to, I think we got about a half an hour and would love to hear from you all. One of my teachers, Angel Kilda Williams, always ends her Dharma talks, or she ended one Dharma talk once by saying, all right, so who's got some answers? And I think part of what I would love to invite is to not create this like question and answers dynamic where it assumes that all you have are questions and all I have are answers, because that's definitely not the case. So questions, answers, reflections, anything that might. Wow. Okay. That was very fierce. And I need to take a deep breath myself to re all sorts of challenges. So that comment was that one of the things that we need to do in the world right now is to spend more time talking about solutions than just talking about the problems. And it's one of the most beautiful things about movements like when I was at Standing Rock in the early days of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Like those encampments were forms of nonviolent direct action. They weren't supposed to be there. We weren't supposed to be there, but it was like a time machine, right? Like the early days of the Occupy encampments and the encampment at Standing Rock was a vision of the kind of world that we wanted to create. There were artists and doctors and childcare workers and herbalists, and like everyone was there creating the world that we wanted to live in. And I think it's so important that our resistance movements begins to model more and more of the world that we want to build, even in our process for resisting the things that we want to change. So yeah, thank you for that. Love to welcome other comments, questions.
those while people in the room think about their questions. So, one question is, would you talk more about grief rituals? What you said before was beautiful.
Um, years ago, years ago, I was in Southern California. Hello? Okay. I was in Southern California doing a fierce vulnerability workshop, and it's when the school shootings in Uvalde, Texas happened. And I was in the midst of the workshop, and then right after the workshop, I had to go somewhere else, do another event, and then do a conference, and I was just like busy, you know. Um, so I heard the news, and I was kind of like, another one. And then I just kept going because I was busy. And then I got home, you know, a week later or whatever it was. And I realized when I got home that like my entire body felt stuck because I had just heard the story of however many children who were killed, and I hadn't had an opportunity to grieve. And so I remember going home and realizing that and intentionally sitting down and looking up the stories of every single child that was killed that I could find and printing out their pictures and putting them on my altar and just crying, just sitting there by myself crying because, you know, it's so crazy. We live in this society where school shootings and mass killings and war and all these things are like normalized. And it hit me that we normalize killing, but we don't normalize death. Like there's something about like the fact that people are getting killed all the time, we like completely normalize, but we don't actually um really accept the grief that comes with each death. We are such a death phobic society. Um, and if we don't grieve these things that like as human beings, it is impossible for us to hear about these things, to witness these things, and not have grief come up. And if we don't give space to honor that and to process that, we just like shove it down inside of our bodies. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book is our bodies are grieving, whether we know it or not, whether we give space for it or not. Our bodies know that people are being killed every day, that ecosystems are in a state of collapse, countless species are going extinct every day. And it takes an incredible amount of spiritual strength and energy to constantly deny a truth that our bodies know is true. Like our bodies are grieving, but for our minds and our intellects to constantly be working overtime to say, nothing to see here, everything's going according to plan, just keep moving through the day, is just like constantly sapping our spirit. And what could we do with that energy with all of that energy that we are constantly using to deny a truth that our bodies know, if we could just like let the grief go, to witness it, to honor it, to integrate it, what could we do with all of that energy? How much creativity, how much hope, how much connection could we have if we weren't so busy stuffing down grief that I really believe that we're all holding? And so I really do think that, you know, in Fierce Vulnerability Network, we're really trying to do more and more like public grief rituals and bringing grief work not just to like the few pockets of progressives that'll like voluntarily come to a grief ceremony, but to actually do it in public spaces and create more and more spaces for people to touch into an emotion that I think is human and I think it's is really important for us to be feeling. Yeah. I can no longer do social change work without being explicit about a relationship with spirit. Um, I use the word spirit very broadly speaking. I think I write about it in the book. I forgot what, you know, what pieces of it got edited out and all that, but I don't think he would like this, but I consider Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, to be one of my great spiritual guides because when I hear him talk about the cosmos, I am filled with the same awe and the same inspiration and the same humility and just the vastness of the cosmos fills me with the same awe that I am filled with when I attend a spiritual ceremony. And I think what it does is it taps me into the reality that I am connected to something that is so much greater than myself as an individual. And I think nonviolent direct action, resistance work has to be about reminding people that we belong to each other, that we are so much greater than just ourselves as individuals, and that nonviolent movement work is about so much more than winning, like for our people. It's about reminding ourselves that I will never be free until you are free, right? There's one of the civil rights elders talked about how the civil rights movement was a battle for the bodies of black folks and the souls of white folks, right? Like even in battling white supremacists, they understood that it is actually for their liberation, because being a supremacist on anything is a delusion. You are living in a delusion and you are hurting your soul in doing that work. And so for me, using nonviolent action as ceremony is about reminding ourselves of something greater. And part of what that means in practice is like, how are we preparing ourselves to go into direct action spaces? I know that when I go into a spiritual ceremony, there's oftentimes like 3 days of fasting before the ceremony, and like not be on my phone as much, and all these ways that like I prepare my spirit to enter sacred space. And nonviolent actions, like there's none of that. And so I really want us to take these things seriously. And if we're organizing a major demonstration, how do we prepare our spirit for like the week beforehand, as if we know we are going into sacred space, we're going into a place that has the potential to heal wounds that are centuries old. So yeah, it's a little bit of what comes up for me.
Okay, I'm going to slip in two questions that are related. There are some great questions online. First off, you've said a lot about vulnerability and less about what it means to be fierce. So would you please talk about that? And in listening to you, one listener has said, I recognize that I feel a lot of righteousness and resentment. Don't we have to name that? How do we deal with that in this fierce vulnerability frame?
Thank you so much. I was at this retreat many years ago, and it wasn't the plan, but it ended up being potentially the most healing experience I've ever been around the legacy of patriarchy. So there's a lot of stories that emerged from that week that I could tell you about, but I remember this one moment where um, I forgot what set it off, but a woman stood up, and it was a circle of about 50 people, and slowly walked around and paused in front of every male identifying person and looked at us in the eye. And this woman was like in tears, like tears streaming down her face. And in a voice that, if you misunderstood her intention, could have almost sounded like anger, was demanding that we look into her eyes. And through her tears, she was saying, "Look at me. This is what you did to me. I need you to understand the impact that you have had on me." And walked around every single person. And at the end of that circle, I've been in so many spaces, circles, healing spaces, where there's not like a dry eye in the room. This was the first time that every single person was huddled in one of like 5 or 6 just piles of people, just wailing for like what felt like a half an hour. And it was medicine, right? That this person gave us this opportunity to go that deep into our wound. And I'm sharing this story as a response to that first question because, this woman was like crying, telling us intimate stories about her pain points. Was she being vulnerable or fierce? like I really realized in doing this work that vulnerability and fierceness are just like opposite sides of the same coin. That if we are able to tap into our vulnerability and use it as medicine to try to help heal other people's wounds, that is fierce. Like speaking our deepest truths is both vulnerable and fierce at the same time. And so I think that's one of the things that really emerged for me is, fierce vulnerability almost sounds like an oxymoron, but it's really not. It's actually talking about the same things. Like speaking my most vulnerable truth is some of the most courageous things I have ever done. I work with this he's home now, but this man who was serving a life sentence for a homicide that he committed. I wrote about this. I think it was in the first book. And he said that committing a homicide took no courage. He said that that was an act based entirely on fear. He said the most courageous thing he has ever done was to come to a group and sit in circle and share all of who he was, his fears, his insecurity. That was the most courageous, most fiercest things he has ever done was to be vulnerable, And so, yeah, fierceness and vulnerability. And on the point of righteousness and resentment, I talk a lot about, in addition to grief rituals, one of the things that we're really talking about in our work is the importance of like rage rituals, because rage is another really powerful emotion that is a very natural response to what is happening in the world. And when used carefully, it can be a really powerful tool. I think one of the most important things is oftentimes when anger comes up, it comes up at the same time as a little seed of hatred and resentment. And to discern where is the anger and where is the resentment, and to be able to separate those two things and process the hatred and resentment so that it's not like conflated with the anger. So oftentimes when we get angry, we're angry at individual people, and there's a seed of anger, like resentment and hatred there. And if we can remove that, then we oftentimes see that beneath the anger is actually love or grief or loneliness, right? They say anger is a secondary reaction that your body has to hide a deeper emotion. Oftentimes I'm feeling lonely, and it sucks to feel lonely. So I'd rather feel angry at that person for making me feel lonely, right? I'm externalizing something that I don't want to feel. There's a beautiful story that I heard once that I also included in the book. When the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, there was a young Japanese military soldier who had an uncle who had a bookshop. He owned a bookshop in Hiroshima. And the morning after the bomb was dropped, he went to his uncle's bookshop to see if he could find his uncle. And of course, not only could he find his uncle, but the entire bookshop was just demolished, and there were flames still burning where his bookshop was. And at the time, Japanese people use little charcoal warmers. They put little charcoal in these metal cases and then put it in a pouch, and they used it like little hand warmers, right, to keep you warm at night. And so he used the fire from the burning building to light his charcoal warmer. And then he brought that charcoal back home to his village, and he used it to start a fire. And he kept feeding that fire, and he kept feeding that fire for years and years, actually. And he says for the first many years, it was a symbol of his hatred and his anger. But because he had this actual physical fire to represent his hatred and his anger, he was able to burn it off, and it ultimately transformed into this eternal flame for peace that still burns in Hiroshima to this day. And years ago, my mentor and second mom, Jun-san, the Buddhist nun that I told you about, she organized this walking pilgrimage across the country, the Hiroshima Flame Peace Walk, where she took a charcoal hand warmer, like the one that this guy used to use, lit it using the Hiroshima Peace Flame that is still burning to this day, and then snuck it into the United States because the customs wouldn't let it in, but managed to sneak it in and walked cross country with it. And I got to join a part of that walk. And I remember the moment that the leaders of the walk handed me the charcoal like warmer and let me walk with it. And I was hit with this wave of emotion of like, this is the flame from the bomb that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Hiroshima, and is the same flame that people have been praying over for world peace for decades and decades. It's the same flame. And I always think that that's such a powerful example of like when sometimes we just need to let righteousness and rage burn in an inferno. And once it burns down, you realize that there's a charcoal underneath all of that, and that that charcoal has a very different energy. Instead of it burning down everything in its path, you can use it to keep you warm at night. And so I think with righteousness and resentment and things like that, sometimes you need spaces where you can just let it all burn. And if that righteousness, if that rage, if that hatred, if that resentment can be honored and witnessed, you'll oftentimes notice that there's something much deeper and much more powerful underneath all of that. So creating space to honor all of that righteousness and that resentment. The question for folks on online is, where are the Fierce Vulnerability workshops offered? Um, I need to put more of them on the calendar, is the real question. I've just been so busy traveling right now. The one that I do have is through the organization Pioneers. I think it's in the fall. It's like 4 weekly sessions online. And I'm going to be putting some more up on my website as soon as I get home, scheduling some more. Eventually, I want to do like a residential fierce vulnerability training of trainers, so more people are trained to give this training. And I'm hoping to do some in-person workshops as well. But I'm also, I'm a trainer, so call me and we can work something out. All right, cool. That question over there too? I'm enjoying my time here, so. I didn't realize that's what that was. Thank you for letting me know. Thank you so much for all of that. Um, One of my favorite quotes in these times, that I've been saying a lot, it's a little ironic that it actually comes from the US Navy SEALs. They teach their soldiers that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you. So the question was, as a Jewish anti-Zionist, um, how do you balance like the urgency of this moment of knowing that there's a genocide happening, that people are being slaughtered every single day, with the kind of long-term visioning, building, imagining the future that we want after the battle is over? Does that kind of sum it up? Um, and so, yeah, there's this quote that says, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. That if we can do the work, front loading the work to actually learn to breathe and regulate our nervous systems in these urgent moments, we're actually able to like glide through them. So I really do want to emphasize in our communities doing the things that help to slow us down, so that we are able to respond to moments of urgency without coming from a place of panic ourselves. I think one of the dangers is like there's so much urgency in the world, so we become urgent and then we respond to the urgency with urgency, and we're only adding more urgency to the world, and everything just becomes panic. So I think the importance of remembering to breathe. um, and I'll also say that we need a movement ecosystem that is as diverse as any natural ecosystem. And so some people are going to be called to be on the front lines doing more of like the immediate trying to stop the harm that is happening right now, while other people can be there doing the long-term culture building work. And all of that is necessary. We just need to be talking to each other. Um, my friends at the Ayni Institute, Ayni is spelled Ayni. It's a Quechua word for reciprocity. They do a lot of amazing trainings, including a training called the movement ecology training, where they map the entire ecology that is necessary for social change to happen. And one of them is like nonviolent direct action and that kind of work, but all of these other sectors of the movement. And they're all happening, but we don't talk to each other. We assume that like, oh, because we're doing activism and you're doing this over there, we're a different movement, but it can't be that. And so to trust that, you know, you're doing your piece and other people are doing other pieces, because it's all necessary. We kind of need all hands on deck, you know. So yeah, thank you. Time for a couple more, maybe?
Depends on how long your answer is. So, um, but this one I think follows. So, and it came early in the evening, and from a Kingian trainer. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what, one of the kinds of communities are the persons and communities who really feel a need for defense, for self-defense. And so how does the fierce vulnerability, opportunity, challenge read onto that?
Love this question. You can imagine I get it a lot. So I've always said this, that the role of an advocate for nonviolence is not to cast judgment on communities and people who feel like they need to use violence to survive. I'm an advocate for self-defense. I'm an advocate for like martial arts, things like that. Violence can be very effective in keeping you alive. It can be very effective in keeping the people that you care about alive. There is great value in that. And one thing violence can never do is to heal and strengthen relationships. Violence will never get you there. So nonviolence to me is not about saying that you can never use violence. To me, that's how I read it. But it is about understanding that violence has one significant limitation. That if our work is building beloved community, if our work is helping more and more people feel like they belong to each other, then violence will never be able to get you there. And so even if people, communities feel like they have to use violence momentarily to keep themselves alive, what are they doing on the other side of that to rebuild beloved community? There's a beautiful quote from Pauline Murray who says, "When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them." Right? So what are we doing to like continue to widen and widen the circle so that one day we can get to beloved community? So I think it's 8:30. Is there one? Yeah. One more. All right, we'll do one more. Yeah. Yeah. So the question, if I could try to summarize, is like even in nonviolent resistance, nonviolent direct action, how do we remind people of the possibilities of beauty and community? And does that kind of sum it up? Yeah, like when was the last time that you witnessed beauty and community and love in a nonviolent direct action? Like I rarely see that. And I really, like Gandhi said, like peace is not the like the end result, it's the way, right? And I really do believe that we have to integrate the world that we want to create in the process of us creating it. And so I really believe that nonviolent direct actions have to be so explicit about thinking about, how does this look beautiful? How does this look joyful? How do we create like protests and demonstrations that remind people the possibilities of who we can be as a species? And I think, so often nonviolent direct actions, like people go out there with shields and we're screaming and we're yelling and we're holding signs. And I'll just maybe close with this one short story. The place where the words fierce vulnerability first emerged for us was an action where activists shut down the governor's mansion in North Carolina as part of the battle to stop the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And they went to the governor's mansion, they occupied it, shut it down, and they had a conversation the night before about what are the qualities that we long to see in this action. And they said beauty and connection and love and all these things. And so out of that conversation, they decided not to hold any signs and not to do any chants. And it's kind of like, what does a protest without chanting and signs look like? And so what they did was they sat down in the lobby of the governor's mansion, and among other things, they held a prayer vigil because they found out that a police officer from that department was killed in the line of duty the night before. So they did a prayer vigil for the police officer, which got the police officers who were there like in tears and feeling connected. And when apparently at the very end of the protest, when the officers were arresting them, because someone ordered pizza for the protesters too, and the protesters offered pizza to the police officers. And when the police officers were arresting these protesters at the very end, one of them said, "Thank you so much for your hospitality," like as they were being arrested. But anyways, what they did was they sat down in a circle when the lieutenant governor came down. The governor was out of town. They asked him to sit in the circle, and each person went around and shared why they were there, many of them being moved to tears and talking about the fears that they had for their children and things like that. And they said that they could see like the tears welling up in the eyes of the lieutenant governor and how thankful he was for being there, for the protesters being there. And so I think it's possible to have like the fierceness of shutting down the governor's mansion, but to do it in a way that creates more and more connection, and I think I think the question of like, how do we do it and what does it look like? That is the question. I don't have all the answers, but I think if we're asking the right questions, like the one that you just asked, I have a lot of faith that we can figure it out together. So thank you all so much for being here. And I know I'm going to be hanging out for a little while longer, so really looking forward to continuing our conversation, but I'll hand the mic.
Thank you so much. You have blessed all of us in ways that we cannot begin to express to you. Thanks for being fiercely vulnerable. Amen. Beloved, go out the store and on the table right there in the lobby, buy your book. Buy your book. And I have just made an executive decision that we will be having a book discussion that we will set up for the month of June. It's wonderful to be in charge of people. You can just decide what they're going to do. We're going to do, we need to have further conversations and more in-depth conversations. So be looking for that. Look, I just looked over there and told them June. Hopefully we'll have it done by then. And you'll be ready to be in conversation with us. This is something that, that cannot just be an action. It is something that we need to really be in conversation about and be fiercely vulnerable about, to be able to actually do some healing. Yes, I am a preacher, and eat cookies out on the porch. So we're going to ask you to leave this space to enter into a greater space to have dialogue. Thank you all for coming this evening.